This morning, Bureau of Reclamation operating data showed Lake Powell hovering roughly 34 feet above minimum power pool, the elevation below which Glen Canyon Dam can no longer generate hydropower normally. One signal would be unusual. Several signals together are harder to dismiss. The reservoir is sitting near 1/4 of capacity. Upper Colorado River runoff has arrived far below the historical average. Water is leaving the lake faster than weak summer inflows can replace it. And federal projections now place critical operating elevations within the planning horizon, not in some distant theoretical future. But that is not the most dangerous part. The visible number is 34 feet. The hidden number is the shrinking amount of time operators have to change releases, move water between reservoirs, protect turbine operations, and preserve the dam's ability to send water downstream. This is not just a drought. This is an operating margin failure, moving toward the machinery of the Colorado River system. So the question is no longer simply whether Lake Powell will rise or fall. The question is, what happens when a narrowing reservoir margin reaches the turbine, the transmission line, the irrigation district, the tribal community, the city water department, and every institution, depending on predictable releases through Glen Canyon Dam? Like, subscribe, and comment where you are watching from, because this reservoir gauge is showing more than falling water. It is showing where an interconnected system may lose room to maneuver first. Before sunrise, the warning was already visible, not as a flashing red banner, but as a line of federal operating data moving toward an elevation. The Colorado River system was never meant to approach casually. The Bureau of Reclamation was tracking Lake Powell near 3,524 feet above sea level, roughly 34 feet above minimum power pool at Glen Canyon Dam, at 3,490 feet. The reservoir is no longer high enough for the power plant to generate electricity normally. That threshold is not an abstract mark drawn across a canyon wall. It is the point at which water pressure, turbine performance, downstream releases, electrical deliveries, and emergency operating choices begin to collide. By morning, the first light over the reservoir would reveal pale bands of exposed sandstone and long boat ramps descending toward shorelines that had moved again. But inside the operating system, the day had begun hours earlier. Reservoir gauges had updated, river forecasts had shifted, release schedules had been checked. Power customers had compared expected generation with the electricity they would need to replace. Engineers had looked at a number that appeared stable for the moment and asked a more difficult question. How much room remained if the forecast weakened again? The Bureau of Reclamation does not operate Lake Powell by looking only at today's surface elevation. Its teams work through a network of measurements and models extending across the upper Colorado River basin. Snow gauges in the Rocky Mountains estimate how much water remains stored above the river. Stream gauges measure what has already entered the channels. Weather forecasts estimate how much additional snow or rain may arrive. Soil moisture tells forecasters how much melting snow will disappear into dry ground before it reaches a tributary. Temperature determines how quickly the snowpack releases. Reservoir operators then combine those signals with legal delivery requirements, environmental flows, hydropower needs, and conditions downstream at Lake Mead. On their own, each number can be treated as a separate technical update. Together, they describe one larger configuration. The reservoir is low. The incoming supply is weak. The release obligation continues. The power plant depends on elevation, and the time available to recover before the next high-demand season is narrowing. Earlier in the water year, federal planners had expected Lake Powell to remain above minimum power pool. Then, the runoff outlook deteriorated. The Colorado Basin River Forecast Center, part of the National Weather Service, reported that projected inflow into Lake Powell had fallen far below the historical average. This was not merely a disappointing snow season. It was a failure of expected water to complete the journey from mountain to reservoir. Snow can appear on a map and still produce weak runoff. When soils are dry, they absorb more meltwater. When temperatures rise early, snow can melt before the system is ready to capture it efficiently. When storms miss critical headwaters, basin-wide totals can conceal sharp regional deficits. The river does not receive the number printed on a snowpack chart. It receives what survives the land. By spring, that distinction had become operational. Reclamation's drought response planning identified a credible risk that Lake Powell could fall below minimum power pool without intervention. Federal projections showed scenarios in which the reservoir approached or crossed 3,490 feet during the second half of the year. The agency began preparing additional releases from upstream Colorado River storage project reservoirs, including Flaming Gorge, Blue Mesa, and Navajo, to reduce that risk. This is where the dashboard stops looking like a single lake and begins to resemble a system moving water between compartments to protect one critical machine. Water held hundreds of miles upstream can be released to support Lake Powell, but every acre-foot moved for emergency protection is an acre-foot no longer stored in that upstream reservoir for its own future needs. The intervention can create time. It cannot manufacture runoff. At roughly the same moment, the Western Area Power Administration was watching the same decline from another direction. WAPA markets electricity generated at Glen Canyon Dam and other federal hydroelectric facilities across the Colorado River storage project. That power reaches public utilities, rural electric cooperatives, irrigation districts, tribal utilities, military facilities, and other customers across the West. The electricity does not remain at the dam. It moves through transmission lines, contracts, balancing schedules, and wholesale power markets. When Glen Canyon generates less, WAPA may need to purchase replacement electricity. That power can cost more, particularly when demand is high. The reduced generation can therefore move outward as financial pressure long before anyone experiences a blackout. The map shows a reservoir in Arizona and Utah, but the operational signal can reach a municipal utility far from the shoreline. As the lake falls, the water pressing toward the turbines loses hydraulic head. In simple terms, the power plant receives less force from the weight of water above it. Less force means each unit of released water can produce less electricity. The plant can lose generation before it reaches the formal minimum power pool threshold. That is the first abnormal detail. The danger does not begin exactly at 3,490 feet. Performance erodes on the approach. The second abnormal detail is that the dam must still pass water downstream. Glen Canyon is not only a power station holding back a lake, it is a delivery structure inside a legally and physically connected river system. Water released from Lake Powell enters the Colorado River through Glen Canyon, moves through the Grand Canyon, and eventually reaches Lake Mead. Reducing releases may protect Powell temporarily, but it can also affect the balance between the two largest reservoirs in the United States. Increasing upstream releases may support Powell, but it draws down other storage accounts. Every choice changes another number somewhere else. By midday, the operating picture contained several lights at once. Lake Powell remained only a few dozen feet above minimum power pool. Inflow forecasts were among the weakest portions of the historical record. The planned annual release from Glen Canyon Dam still represented millions of acre-feet moving downstream. Upper basin reservoirs were being evaluated as emergency support. Hydropower customers were being warned that a loss of generation could remove a large share of Colorado River storage project power deliveries. Meanwhile, summer heat was increasing electricity demand across parts of the West, precisely when reduced hydropower flexibility mattered most. One signal would be manageable. Several signals together create a configuration. Water supply, power supply, legal obligation, ecosystem management, and seasonal demand were beginning to occupy the same narrow operating space. Yet from outside, the day could appear uneventful. There was no wall of water crossing a highway. No siren announced that the reservoir had lost another foot. Tour boats might still move across open water. Turbines might still turn beneath the dam. Electricity might still flow into the grid. This is what makes slow operational emergencies difficult to recognize. The system can continue functioning while its margin is being consumed. A hospital appears normal while its backup fuel runs down. A city water system appears normal while reservoir storage falls. A power grid appears normal, while reserve generation disappears. Lake Powell can still look enormous, while the useful distance between the water surface and a critical intake becomes dangerously small. The event is visible outside. The damage begins inside the operating margin. By afternoon, every agency involved was answering a different version of the same question. Reclamation was asking how to preserve releases and protect critical elevations. River forecasters were asking how much additional water the basin could realistically produce. WAPA was asking how much hydropower would remain available and what replacement electricity could cost. State water managers were asking how emergency actions might affect their allocations and future negotiations. Environmental teams were examining how altered releases and warmer reservoir layers could affect downstream temperatures, sediment, fish, and Grand Canyon ecosystems. Recreation managers were dealing with ramps, access points, and moving shorelines. Tribal nations were confronting both immediate infrastructure challenges and a deeper imbalance, because many hold legally recognized water rights while still lacking complete systems to deliver that water to homes and farms. The same falling surface was entering different institutions through different doors. This was not one agency issuing one warning. It was a chain of agencies observing the same physical constraint from separate responsibilities. And that chain extended beyond government offices. At the dam, operators had to keep turbines and release structures within safe ranges. Along the transmission network, dispatchers had to match electricity supply with changing demand. In farming regions, irrigation managers had to plan around deliveries that could become more expensive or politically contested. In cities, water departments had to defend conservation programs to residents who might see a wet winter in one state and assume the crisis had ended. The dashboard was not showing a single disaster. It was showing the early stages of coordination stress. Each institution could still perform its task, but fewer options remained that did not transfer pressure to someone else. Release more water from upstream, and upstream storage declines. Hold more water in Powell, and less reaches Mead. Continue normal releases, and the power pool margin shrinks. Replace hydropower with market purchases, and customer costs rise. Push decisions into the future, and the remaining choices may become sharper. This is not just a drought. This is an operating margin failure. The distinction matters because drought describes a shortage in the environment. An operating margin failure describes what that shortage is doing to a designed system. The river may be dry, but the crisis emerges through elevations, intake structures, contracts, turbines, transmission schedules, reservoir rules, and deadlines. The weather creates the load. Infrastructure determines how the load travels. Institutions decide where it lands. That evening, Lake Powell could remain above minimum power pool, and the official status could still read operational. But the absence of immediate failure would not mean the warning had disappeared. It would mean the system had survived another day by using part of the space separating normal operations from emergency operations. The unanswered question was no longer whether the dam could generate electricity tonight. It was how many additional weak inflow months, high release periods, and hot demand days could pass before the system had to sacrifice one objective to protect another. And to understand why 34 feet can carry consequences far larger than the number suggests, the next step is to enter the reservoir itself and measure what that distance really means. 34 feet sounds like distance. At Lake Powell it is time, pressure, electricity, water delivery, and institutional freedom compressed into one vertical measurement. The headline number begins with 2 elevations. The Bureau of Reclamation identifies 3,490 feet above sea level as minimum power pool at Glen Canyon Dam. Near 3,524 feet, the reservoir stands about 34 feet above that threshold. To picture the distance, imagine an ordinary 3-story building standing between the lake surface and the level where normal hydropower generation can no longer continue. From the top, 34 feet may look reassuring. In the operating system, it is a remarkably thin layer. Lake Powell was designed to rise as high as 3,700 feet. At that level, the surface would stand 210 feet above minimum power pool. A margin of 34 feet is therefore only a small fraction of the original vertical operating range above the turbines. The number is not just water depth, it is a major reservoir being pulled toward the lower edge of its design. But even that description can be misleading, because a foot of elevation does not represent the same amount of water everywhere in the reservoir. Lake Powell occupies a maze of flooded canyons. Near the top, the reservoir spreads across broad areas, and each vertical foot can contain a large volume. Near the bottom, the water contracts into narrower channels. As the lake falls, the relationship between elevation and storage changes. 34 vertical feet cannot be treated like 34 identical blocks of supply stacked above the dam. The shape of the canyon matters. The surface area matters. The volume released each day matters. Evaporation matters. Inflow matters most of all. The reservoir is not descending through a measuring cylinder. It is retreating through irregular stone. That is why the headline number must be translated into movement. 1 foot can disappear slowly during a strong runoff year, or quickly when inflow is weak and releases continue. A reservoir elevation is a position. Risk depends on velocity. If Lake Powell loses several feet over a season, the question is not simply how much lower it has become. The question is how many operating decisions were consumed during that descent, and how much water remains available to reverse it. According to the Bureau of Reclamation, minimum power pool is the lowest elevation at which Glen Canyon Dam can produce hydropower through its penstocks. The penstocks are enormous water passages inside the dam. They carry reservoir water toward the turbines. Above the threshold, gravity and the weight of the reservoir create hydraulic head, the pressure difference that drives water through the machinery. Below it, the dam loses its normal hydropower pathway. The plant does not gradually become irrelevant only after crossing the line. Its performance changes on the way down. As the water surface falls, the vertical distance between the reservoir and the turbines shrinks. The pressure weakens. The same volume of released water produces less energy. Generating units can face narrower operating ranges, lower efficiency, vibration concerns, and additional maintenance challenges. The visible number makes the headline. The approaching number changes the machine. Glen Canyon Dam has 8 generating units and an installed capacity measured at more than 1,000 megawatts. Installed capacity is the maximum rating under suitable conditions, not a promise that the plant will produce that amount at every moment. Actual generation depends on reservoir elevation, release volume, maintenance schedules, environmental operating rules, and power demand. When the lake was high, Glen Canyon could use its stored water and hydraulic head to produce large quantities of flexible electricity. Operators could increase or decrease generation within permitted limits to help follow changes in demand. That flexibility has value beyond the raw number of megawatt hours. A power system must balance electricity, supply, and consumption continuously. Hydropower can respond quickly. It can help when demand rises in the evening, when another generator trips offline, or when wind and solar output change. As Lake Powell declines, the system does not merely lose some energy. It can lose part of a tool used to manage timing. The number is not just 34 feet. It is flexibility being pulled out of position. The historical comparison makes the margin more difficult to dismiss. Lake Powell began filling after Glen Canyon Dam was completed in the 1960s. For decades, the reservoir became an image of enormous stored abundance. At full pool, its water reached deep into side canyons, covered former landmarks, and placed the marina shoreline far above its present position. In 1999, Lake Powell was close to full. During the prolonged drying that followed, storage declined through repeated cycles of drought, partial recovery, demand, and renewed loss. In April of 2023, the reservoir reached its lowest elevation since it initially filled, just under 3,520 feet. The current headline sits close to that historic low zone. That matters because a level once treated as nearly unimaginable became physically real. and then remained part of the operating conversation. A record low is not only a statistic from the past, it becomes proof that the system can enter that range. The comparison also exposes an important difference between full pool and minimum power pool. Full pool is 3,700 feet. Minimum power pool is 3,490. The total gap is 210 vertical feet. At roughly 34 feet above the lower threshold, more than 80% of that vertical margin has already disappeared. This does not mean more than 80% of all usable water is gone, because reservoir volume does not decline evenly with elevation, but it does show how far the surface has moved through the dam's hydropower operating range. The lake is no longer fluctuating near the center of its design envelope. It is moving close to a boundary where another way of releasing water may be required. That boundary is especially serious because minimum power pool is not the same as dead pool. Dead pool lies lower, near the elevation where water could no longer pass through the dam by gravity through existing outlet structures. Between minimum power pool and dead pool is a dangerous operational zone. Hydropower would be lost, but water delivery obligations and downstream needs would continue. Releases would have to move through lower bypass facilities, and those facilities were not designed to provide the same combination of capacity, flexibility, and energy recovery as the turbines. The dam would still be standing, the river would still exist, yet the system would be forced to do the same job through a smaller set of pathways. That is the real meaning of a threshold. It is not always the point where everything stops. It is the point where normal options disappear. Now convert the number into daily experience. A visitor looking across Lake Powell sees a vast body of blue water and may struggle to understand how something so large could be close to an operating limit. Scale conceals vulnerability. The reservoir can stretch for many miles while remaining shallow relative to a critical intake at one location. A homeowner can have water in the bathtub while the city reservoir is in crisis. A fuel tank can look large while holding only enough for one more trip. Lake Powell still contains millions of acre-feet, but not every acre-foot is equally accessible, equally useful, or equally positioned. Water stored below the power pool cannot create normal hydropower. Water committed to downstream releases cannot be counted as permanent protection. Water expected from snow does not exist in the reservoir until it survives soil, vegetation, tributaries, heat, and evaporation. The headline number describes where the water is today. It does not guarantee where it will be after the next release cycle. Federal operating rules provide another comparison. Under drought response planning, 3,525 feet has been treated as a protective target elevation. That is 35 feet above minimum power pool. The purpose of that buffer is not to declare the reservoir healthy. It is to reduce the chance of crossing the power threshold while operators manage uncertainty. A lake standing around 34 feet above minimum power pool is therefore not merely near a dramatic media number. It is near the protective buffer that agencies themselves identified as operationally important. That small difference changes how the measurement should be read. The lake is not approaching a line that no one expected to matter until the last moment. It is entering a zone already recognized in federal drought agreements as requiring attention, and the forecast can move faster than the reservoir. Reclamation's 24-month studies examine probable minimum, most probable, and probable maximum inflow scenarios. They are not prophecies. They are planning tools built around different hydrologic outcomes. In a wet scenario, Lake Powell can gain elevation and restore margin. In a weak scenario, continued releases and poor inflow can drive it downward. A projection that crosses minimum power pool does not prove the crossing will occur. It proves that the outcome is plausible enough for operators to plan around it. That distinction is essential. Certainty is not required for operational danger. A pilot does not wait for fuel to reach zero before diverting. A grid operator does not wait for every reserve generator to fail before issuing an emergency alert. A reservoir manager cannot wait until the surface touches the intake threshold before searching for additional water. The 34-foot number changes decisions because it limits the time available to be wrong. This is why the ordinary comparison of a three-story building is useful but incomplete. Buildings do not melt under heat, leave through turbines, evaporate from exposed surfaces, or depend on snow hundreds of miles away. The buffer is moving. Water is continually arriving and leaving. During a strong runoff pulse, the margin can expand. During a hot, dry period, evaporation rises, while tributary contributions weaken. Releases continue according to operating plans, legal structures, and downstream requirements. Every day produces a new balance. The reservoir is not 34 feet from danger, in the way a parked car is 34 feet from a cliff. It is a moving vehicle whose speed, fuel, road grade, and braking distance are changing at the same time. But that is not the most important part. The headline focuses on the distance between the surface and minimum power pool. The real system depends on how quickly that distance can be rebuilt after it is used. A reservoir can survive one low year if the next year restores storage. It can survive a weak runoff if demand and releases leave enough room for recovery. The deeper danger appears when low storage becomes the starting point for another dry cycle. Then each new season begins with less insurance. Each forecast error matters more. Each emergency release from an upstream reservoir transfers scarcity instead of solving it. Each foot lost is not simply another foot closer to a turbine threshold. It is one less foot available to absorb the next surprise. So 34 feet is shocking, but it is still the visible number. To understand what may actually decide the outcome, we have to look at the water that has not arrived, the volume that must still leave, and the shrinking recovery time hidden between them. The number everyone remembers is 34 feet. The number that may decide the future is not measured in feet at all. It is measured in time. Time for snow to melt, time for water to reach the reservoir, time for the lake to recover before the next demand cycle begins, time remaining before operators run out of flexible choices. The visible number makes the headline. The hidden number writes the damage. Imagine two reservoirs standing at exactly the same elevation. On paper, they appear equally healthy. Yet one is receiving a strong pulse of mountain runoff, while the other is losing more water each week than it gains. Their elevations match today, but their futures do not. Elevation is a photograph. Water balance is a motion picture. That difference explains why reservoir managers spend as much time studying forecasts as they do measuring current conditions. A lake is not protected by the water already inside it, alone. It is protected by the water that is still expected to arrive. Throughout the Colorado River Basin, that expectation begins hundreds of miles from Glen Canyon Dam, high in the Rocky Mountains. Every winter, snow accumulates across Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico. From space, those snowfields appear to promise future abundance. But reservoir operators know that snow is only potential storage. Until it becomes runoff reaching Lake Powell, it cannot turn a turbine or satisfy a downstream water obligation. That is why agencies such as the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center do not simply measure snowfall. They estimate runoff efficiency. How much of that snow will actually survive the journey? The answer depends on a hidden chain of processes that rarely appears in headlines. Start with the soil. During prolonged drought, mountain soils become exceptionally dry. When spring warming begins, the first meltwater often disappears into the ground before it reaches streams. The landscape behaves like a giant sponge recovering after years without enough moisture. Snow melts, but rivers do not immediately rise by the same amount. Some of the water is stored underground. Some supports vegetation that has also been waiting for moisture. The reservoir never sees that portion. Next comes temperature. A gradual warming allows snow to melt steadily over weeks, feeding rivers in a controlled pattern. A sudden warm spell can melt snow rapidly, but if soils remain thirsty or evaporation is high, the runoff arriving downstream may still disappoint. Earlier snowmelt can also shift the timing of river peaks, reducing the amount of water available later in summer when reservoirs depend on sustained inflow. Then comes geography. Not every snowstorm falls where it matters equally. A basin can receive respectable snowfall overall, while critical tributaries experience deficits. The map may appear encouraging. The reservoir receives something very different. Finally comes evaporation. As temperatures rise, more water leaves lakes, soils, and vegetation directly into the atmosphere. Climate scientists often describe evaporation as atmospheric demand. Warm air can hold more moisture. The atmosphere effectively asks for more water. Lakes answer whether they want to or not. Every hot, dry, windy day quietly removes storage without opening a single outlet gate. None of these numbers attracts the attention given to reservoir elevation. Yet together, they determine whether 34 feet becomes 40 feet by autumn or 25. This is why the Bureau of Reclamation produces regular 24-month operational studies instead of relying only on current measurements. Operators are not trying to predict a single future. They are preparing for several plausible futures at once. One scenario assumes stronger runoff. Another assumes weaker inflows. Another combines different release requirements, storage levels, and weather conditions. The purpose is not to identify certainty. It is to estimate the range of possible operating space. That operating space has become the hidden number. The public sees lake elevation. Engineers see remaining flexibility. Consider the annual water budget. Lake Powell gains water through inflows from the Colorado River and its tributaries. It loses water through downstream releases, evaporation, bank storage, and other physical processes. If inflow exceeds outflow over time, storage grows. If outflow exceeds inflow, storage declines. That equation sounds almost too simple. Yet every political negotiation, engineering adjustment, conservation program, and emergency release ultimately serves that balance. The challenge is that several terms in the equation cannot be controlled. Operators cannot order snow to fall. They cannot stop evaporation during a heat wave. They cannot command mountain temperatures to remain cool through June. What they can influence is how stored water is managed once it reaches the reservoir. But management becomes harder every year the natural supply weakens. Here the hidden number changes again. It becomes recovery time. Every infrastructure system depends on recovery. Electrical grids recover after demand spikes. Hospitals recover after emergency surges. Forests recover after fire. Reservoirs recover after drought. The danger is not simply experiencing stress. The danger is entering the next stress event before recovery is complete. Lake Powell experienced historic declines during the first decades of the 21st century. Several wet winters temporarily slowed the decline, and the extraordinary snowpack of 2023 improved conditions more than many forecasts had expected. Yet the broader hydrologic picture did not return to 20th century norms. Researchers studying the Colorado River Basin have repeatedly found evidence that rising temperatures have reduced runoff efficiency even during years with respectable precipitation. In other words, similar snowfall no longer guarantees similar river flow. The basin is changing how it converts weather into water. That transformation is subtle enough to escape casual observation, but significant enough to reshape reservoir planning. The hidden number therefore becomes runoff efficiency itself. 2 winters may produce similar snowpack percentages. One fills reservoirs more effectively because cooler conditions, healthier soil moisture, and slower melting allow more water to survive the journey. The other disappoints, despite impressive snow maps, because more water vanishes into soil, vegetation, and the atmosphere before reaching the river. The visible number celebrates snowfall. The hidden number determines storage. Another overlooked variable is release commitment. Glen Canyon Dam cannot simply stop delivering water whenever Lake Powell falls. The Colorado River Compact, subsequent agreements, environmental responsibilities, hydropower operations, and downstream obligations all interact within the operating framework. Water leaving the reservoir is not optional in the ordinary sense. It supports millions of people, agriculture, tribal rights, ecosystems, recreation, and another massive reservoir downstream. That means every weak runoff year begins with a structural challenge. Some water must continue moving, even while recovery slows. Imagine trying to refill a savings account while automatic withdrawals continue every month. Income can improve the balance, but if income falls while withdrawals remain necessary, rebuilding takes much longer. The reservoir experiences a similar constraint. Then there is another hidden number that almost never appears in public conversation: forecast error. Every projection carries uncertainty. Weather systems change. Spring temperatures accelerate or slow melting. Summer monsoons may arrive early or fail entirely. A forecast is not wrong because reality differs slightly. It is designed to describe a range of outcomes, but uncertainty itself becomes more dangerous when operating margins shrink. A reservoir 100 feet above a critical threshold can absorb moderate forecast error. A reservoir 34 feet above that threshold has much less room for surprises. The same forecasting uncertainty produces different operational consequences because the buffer has changed. This explains why emergency planning often begins long before an emergency exists. Officials are not reacting to certainty. They are responding to reduced tolerance for uncertainty. Another hidden number is replacement cost. If Glen Canyon Dam generates less electricity, utilities purchasing federal hydropower may need to obtain energy elsewhere. The physical reservoir level becomes an economic variable. Electricity prices depend on regional demand, available generation, transmission conditions, and fuel costs. Hydropower has historically provided relatively inexpensive and flexible electricity. Losing part of that supply does not automatically create shortages, but it can increase expenses that eventually move through utility budgets and customer bills. Once again, the public sees water. Institutions see financial exposure. But perhaps the most important hidden number is one that cannot be measured directly: confidence. Water managers make long-term decisions based on expectations about future supply. Farmers choose crops months before harvest. Cities approve housing developments years before residents arrive. Utilities invest in infrastructure expected to operate for decades. Confidence allows planning. When runoff becomes consistently less predictable, confidence begins to erode. Institutions become more cautious. Negotiations become more difficult. Every stakeholder asks the same question in different words: can the system still recover fast enough? That question is now more valuable than the reservoir elevation itself. 34 feet describes today's position. Recovery time describes tomorrow's opportunity. Runoff efficiency describes next season's potential. Forecast uncertainty describes the range of possible outcomes. Together, these hidden numbers determine whether the visible number becomes a temporary warning or the beginning of something much larger. But there is one more layer beneath them all, and it cannot be understood from charts alone. Water does not disappear because of a single mysterious force. It moves through a physical mechanism that begins in the mountains, travels across landscapes, enters the reservoir, pushes against turbines, leaves through the dam, and eventually reaches the lives of millions of people. To understand why this system now behaves differently, we have to follow that mechanism step by step from the first snowflake to the last light bulb. The mechanism begins as snow, but the warning begins when snow stops behaving like stored water. High above Lake Powell, winter storms cross the Rocky Mountains and deposit moisture across the upper Colorado River basin. For months, that snowpack appears motionless. In reality, it is the largest seasonal reservoir in the system, holding water at elevation until sunlight, wind, temperature, and gravity release it toward the river. Glen Canyon Dam depends on that delayed movement. The reservoir does not create water. It stores the portion of mountain precipitation that survives long enough to arrive. To understand why Lake Powell can remain only 34 feet above minimum power pool, follow 1 unit of water from the atmosphere to the turbine. A storm first has to reach the right mountains. Moisture must fall as snow rather than rain, because snow can remain stored through winter instead of running downstream immediately. The snow must accumulate deeply enough to resist short, warm periods. It must remain bright enough to reflect sunlight. Dust settling on the surface can darken it, allowing the snowpack to absorb more solar energy and melt sooner. Then spring must arrive gradually. If warming occurs too quickly, the snow releases water in a compressed pulse. If the landscape beneath it is dry, much of that pulse enters the soil before reaching a stream. If vegetation is active, roots pull part of the water upward. The plants release it back into the atmosphere through transpiration. Wind and warm air remove more through evaporation. What begins as snow becomes a contest over who receives the water first. The river only receives what remains. This process is called runoff generation, but the simple phrase hides a long physical journey. Meltwater enters pores in the soil. Some travels downward to groundwater. Some moves sideways across rock layers. Some reaches small channels, then creeks, then tributaries, such as the Green, Gunnison, San Juan, and Colorado. Along the way, the water can be diverted, consumed, stored, delayed, or lost to the atmosphere. By the time it reaches Lake Powell, it has passed through forests, farms, wetlands, towns, irrigation networks, and reservoirs. The number measured at the lake is the final result of thousands of upstream exchanges. This is why a snowpack percentage cannot be treated as a reservoir forecast by itself. Snow is the opening inventory. Runoff is the amount delivered after the landscape takes its share. Researchers with the United States Geological Survey have found that warming reduces the efficiency with which precipitation becomes Colorado River flow. Warmer conditions increase evaporation, accelerate snowmelt, extend the growing season, and expose darker land earlier in the year. Snow reflects sunlight. Bare ground absorbs it. When snow disappears sooner, the surface warms sooner. That additional heat drives more water back into the atmosphere. The process reinforces itself. Less snow cover produces more absorbed energy. More absorbed energy produces more evaporation. More evaporation leaves less water for the river. The mechanism begins above the reservoir, but its first major loss can occur before the water ever enters a visible channel. Now, the surviving runoff reaches Lake Powell. The reservoir spreads through a network of drowned canyons behind Glen Canyon Dam. Incoming river water carries sediment, heat, dissolved material, and seasonal temperature differences. Cold spring runoff can move beneath warmer surface water because colder water is denser. As summer develops, the reservoir separates into layers. Sunlight warms the upper layer. Deeper water remains colder. These layers matter because the dam draws water from fixed elevations. The penstock intakes that supply the turbines are positioned high enough to operate under normal reservoir conditions, but low enough to use the pressure created by the water column above them. When the reservoir is high, a deep body of water presses toward those openings. When the reservoir falls, the column becomes shorter. That shortening is the central hydraulic mechanism. Hydropower is gravity converted into motion, and motion converted into electricity. Water stored above the turbines contains potential energy because of its elevation. Gates regulate its entry into the penstocks. The water accelerates down these enormous passages and strikes turbine runners. The runners rotate shafts connected to generators. Inside each generator, rotating magnetic fields induce an electrical current. The electricity then moves through transformers, switchyards, and high-voltage transmission lines into the Western power system. From mountain snow to household current, the chain is continuous, but every link depends on the height difference between the reservoir surface and the turbine. Engineers call that difference hydraulic head. More head means greater pressure and more potential energy for each unit of water. Less head means the plant must move water with less force available. The headline is falling elevation. The real story is falling head. As Lake Powell approaches minimum power pool, the power plant does not wait for a single dramatic moment before changing. Generation capability declines along the way. Turbines are designed to operate within specific combinations of flow, pressure, and rotational speed. Outside favorable ranges, efficiency falls. Water may move through the machine less smoothly. Pressure fluctuations can create vibration. Under certain conditions, low pressure can allow vapor bubbles to form and collapse against metal surfaces, a process known as cavitation. Cavitation can damage turbine components over time. Operators therefore cannot treat every remaining foot of reservoir elevation as equally usable for power production. They must protect equipment, maintain stable releases, follow environmental restrictions, and respond to power system needs at the same time. By the time the public sees a major decline in megawatt output, the machinery may already be carrying a narrower and more complicated operating load. The electricity produced at Glen Canyon Dam is valuable not only because of its quantity, but because of its timing. Hydroelectric units can change output more rapidly than many large thermal power plants. When demand increases during a hot afternoon or early evening, operators can release more water through turbines within allowed limits. When solar generation drops after sunset, hydropower can help fill part of the gap. When a generator or transmission line unexpectedly fails, reserved capacity at the dam can provide a fast response. The Western Area Power Administration has described Glen Canyon as an important source of emergency hydropower in the West. That does not mean the entire regional grid depends on this one plant. It means the plant performs a flexible role that becomes harder and more expensive to replace when reservoir conditions reduce its capability. A megawatt-hour from a flexible hydroelectric unit is not always equivalent to a megawatt-hour from a resource that cannot respond at the same moment. The mechanism therefore leaves the dam and enters the grid as a loss of options. When hydropower output declines, replacement electricity may come from natural gas plants, market purchases, other hydroelectric facilities, batteries, demand reductions, or a combination of resources. Each replacement has limits. Gas plants need fuel and may produce higher emissions. Market power may become expensive during regional heat. Transmission lines may be constrained. Batteries can respond quickly, but only for as long as their stored charge lasts. Other reservoirs may also be experiencing drought. The grid can compensate, but compensation consumes margin somewhere else. The lake loses hydraulic head. The power system loses inexpensive flexibility. Utilities gain exposure to higher costs. The same missing water changes form as it travels through institutions. But electricity is only one pathway. Water passing through Glen Canyon Dam continues downstream toward the Grand Canyon and Lake Mead. Under normal hydropower operations, most releases move through the turbines. If the reservoir falls below minimum power pool, releases would have to rely more heavily on bypass structures positioned lower in the dam. These outlets can move water without generating electricity, but they do not provide the same operating pathway as the penstocks. Their capacity, condition, temperature effects, and long-term role become increasingly important as the lake approaches the threshold. The dam would not suddenly become a solid wall with no release capability. The system would become more dependent on fewer pieces of infrastructure. That distinction is critical. Failure often begins not when every component stops, but when redundancy disappears. The water itself also changes as the reservoir declines. Lower levels alter which thermal layer reaches a particular intake. Water temperature released downstream influences aquatic ecosystems, including native fish and invasive species. Sediment trapped behind the dam changes beaches and habitats through the Grand Canyon. Release timing affects shorelines, campsites, insects, vegetation, and river safety. A decision made to protect power generation can interact with environmental requirements. A decision made to manage downstream temperature can affect which outlets are used. The machine is not operating in an empty laboratory. It is embedded in a living river. The mechanism moves through rock, steel, electricity, law, and ecology at the same time. Now return to the missing runoff. When a warm, dry year delivers less water to Lake Powell, the first visible result is a lower reservoir surface. Beneath that surface, hydraulic head decreases, turbine efficiency and maximum output weaken. Hydropower revenues can fall, while replacement power costs rise. Water managers may release stored water from upstream reservoirs to protect the power pool, reducing storage elsewhere. Downstream release choices become more constrained. Environmental trade-offs sharpen. Forecast errors become more consequential. The mechanism has traveled from atmosphere to soil, from soil to river, from river to reservoir, from reservoir to turbine, from turbine to grid, and from the grid into public budgets. By the time it becomes visible as a crisis, the system is already carrying load. This is not just a drought. This is a conversion failure. Less mountain moisture is being converted into usable runoff. Less stored elevation is being converted into electrical energy. Less operational margin is being converted into time. And that final conversion may be the most important. Infrastructure can survive stress when operators have enough time to adapt. They can purchase replacement power, modify releases, coordinate reservoirs, repair equipment, negotiate conservation, and prepare customers. But when the reservoir begins each season close to a critical threshold, time becomes another resource flowing out of the system. What does that look like beyond the control room? It looks like a worker deciding whether a more expensive electricity contract can fit inside a rural utility budget. It looks like a farmer watching water and power costs arrive in the same season. It looks like an engineer hearing a vibration inside a machine that millions of people never see. The mechanism begins in the mountains. The consequences enter a human day. And the next part of the story begins with one person standing at the point where those hidden losses finally become impossible to ignore. The body does not experience a reservoir crisis as a line on a federal chart. It experiences it as a decision made inside an ordinary room, on an ordinary afternoon, by someone who cannot afford to choose incorrectly. Consider the operations manager of a small public power utility in the interior West. Her office is not beside Lake Powell. She cannot see Glen Canyon Dam from the window. The reservoir may be hundreds of miles away, hidden behind desert plateaus and transmission corridors. Yet part of the electricity her community has depended on arrives through a federal hydropower system shaped by the water level behind that dam. On the hottest days, when air conditioners are running across homes, clinics, schools, grocery stores, and senior housing, she watches demand rise across a computer screen. Her job is to keep supply and demand balanced while protecting a utility budget that has little room for surprise. At first, falling water enters her day as an email. The Western Area Power Administration reports that drought has reduced hydropower availability. The message does not say the lights will go out. It says less inexpensive federal power may be available, and more replacement energy may need to be purchased from the market. That sounds financial, not physical, but the financial signal is how the physical mechanism crosses the distance from the reservoir to her desk. Snow failed to become enough runoff. Weak runoff failed to rebuild Lake Powell. Lower storage reduced hydraulic head. Reduced head weakened generation. Weaker generation created a gap in the utility's expected power supply. Now she must fill that gap. The water did not reach the reservoir. The cost reaches her anyway. On a mild spring day, replacement electricity may be available at a manageable price. During a widespread heat wave, the situation changes. Every utility in the region may be searching for additional power at the same time. Natural gas plants are running harder. Transmission lines are carrying heavier flows. Solar generation is abundant at midday, but begins falling as the sun lowers, just as residents return home and household demand remains high. Batteries can help, but their stored energy is limited. Hydropower would normally provide part of the flexible response. It can increase output quickly within operational limits, but Lake Powell is low, and every release through Glen Canyon Dam must satisfy more than the electricity market. The water is also part of a river delivery system. The manager cannot simply request another reservoir release as though ordering fuel. She must enter the market. The price on her screen moves upward. This is where drought enters the room. It does not arrive as dust under the door. It arrives as a number beside the words day ahead energy. She can purchase the electricity and protect reliability. But the money must come from somewhere. A large investor-owned utility may spread the additional expense across millions of customers and many generating resources. A small municipal utility or rural cooperative has fewer places to hide it. Its customers may include households already choosing between cooling, medicine, food, and rent. It may serve a water treatment plant whose pumps cannot stop. a clinic storing temperature, sensitive medication, traffic signals along a regional highway, and a grocery store supporting communities far from the next major town. The utility manager sees one price. Behind it are thousands of human decisions. She buys the power. The immediate crisis passes. Air conditioners continue running. The clinic remains cool. The pumps continue moving water. Nothing dramatic appears on the evening news. Yet the system has transferred the reservoir shortage into the utility's balance sheet. If that transfer happens once, the budget may absorb it. If it happens through repeated dry years, the utility must reconsider rates, reserves, maintenance, and long-term contracts. A transformer replacement might be delayed, a line hardening project might be reduced. A planned battery installation might become harder to finance precisely when flexibility is becoming more valuable. The danger is not only a higher bill, it is a drought, slowly consuming the money intended to protect the grid from the next drought, fire, heat wave, or equipment failure. The event is visible at Lake Powell. The vulnerability accumulates inside local infrastructure. Now follow the pathway into one home served by that utility. An older resident lives alone in a small manufactured house. The walls are thin. Afternoon sunlight heats the roof and siding. The air conditioner is not a luxury in July. It is the machine that keeps the indoor environment within a range the body can tolerate. As electricity rates rise, the resident may adjust the thermostat upward to control the bill. A few degrees seems minor, but the body does not experience heat as an annual average. It experiences heat minute by minute through the work required to maintain a safe internal temperature. Blood moves toward the skin. The heart works harder. Sweat removes heat when it can evaporate, but dehydration, medication, age, illness, and humidity can reduce that protection. At night, the building releases heat slowly. Sleep becomes shallow, recovery weakens. The next day begins before the body has returned to its normal baseline. Lake Powell is not heating the room directly. It would be false to claim that one reservoir level caused one person's medical emergency. The pathway is more careful and more important. Reduced hydropower can increase replacement costs. Higher system costs can place pressure on local rates and household decisions. During extreme heat, reduced cooling can increase health risk for vulnerable residents. The mechanism does not guarantee harm. It changes the conditions under which harm becomes more likely. That is how system risk travels. It moves through probability, price, and constrained choice. But the human pathway does not stop at electricity. The same utility may also power wells and pumping stations. In many Western communities, water must be lifted from underground, moved across long distances, treated, pressurized, and stored in tanks before it reaches a faucet. Electricity moves water even when gravity cannot. If power becomes more expensive, water service becomes more expensive to provide. If a pump fails during a high-demand period, replacement equipment and emergency generation are needed immediately. In a city with several redundant pumping stations, operators may reroute flow. In a small or remote community, one failed motor can become the weak point between a functioning system and a boil water notice. The reservoir shortage has now moved through two utilities at once. Less water at elevation produces less hydropower. More expensive power increases the cost of moving local water. Scarcity in one part of the basin magnifies the price of delivering water somewhere else. For tribal communities, the pathway can be even more unequal. Many tribal nations in the Colorado River Basin hold substantial legal water rights. Yet, some households still lack complete plumbing or reliable access to safe running water. A right recognized on paper is not the same as a pipe reaching a home. Delivering water across remote terrain requires wells, treatment systems, pumping stations, storage tanks, electrical connections, construction funding, trained operators, and long-term maintenance. When drought increases competition for water and raises energy costs, communities with incomplete infrastructure can face the greatest burden, despite having contributed least to the system's overuse. The body does not experience a water right as a legal volume. It experiences water as the ability to drink, wash, cool a room, prepare food, and care for a sick family member. The map shows allocations. The household receives infrastructure, or it does not. Return to the utility manager near sunset. Demand is approaching its evening peak. Solar output is declining. She checks the amount of power already purchased, the condition of local lines, the temperature forecast, and the utility's reserve margin. One thunderstorm could cool the community and reduce demand. It could also produce lightning, wind, and a distribution outage. One generator elsewhere in the region could trip. One transmission constraint could make purchased electricity harder to deliver. On their own, these are normal operating concerns. Together, under a reduced hydropower margin, they become harder to separate. The manager is not afraid of a single dramatic collapse. She is watching the system lose the inexpensive, flexible options that normally prevent small problems from becoming large ones. That is the detail most people never see. Reliability is not created only by large power plants. It is created by spare capacity, affordable contracts, healthy transformers, trained crews, fuel reserves, functioning communications, and enough time to respond. When drought removes hydropower, it does not necessarily switch off the grid. It asks every other component to work harder. The human consequence is often hidden because professionals continue succeeding. Operators buy replacement energy. Line workers repair equipment. Water crews keep pumps running. Families reduce consumption. Hospitals test backup generators. The system looks stable because people are absorbing the instability. But there is a limit to how much stress can be absorbed through budgets, labor, and personal sacrifice. The danger is not only the moment a turbine stops. It is the accumulation of smaller decisions made to prevent that moment from reaching the public. Higher purchases this month. Deferred maintenance next year. A warmer bedroom tonight. A smaller reserve before the next heat wave. A water pump running on a tighter budget. A rural clinic depending on an aging backup generator. The reservoir loses feet. People lose choices. This is not just a drought. This is an operating margin failure moving through human lives without announcing itself as one. And once the pathway is visible, the next question becomes unavoidable. Which small physical component stands between these daily compromises and an actual break in service? The answer is not the entire Colorado River system. It is a set of narrow openings, machines, lines, and backup pathways inside Glen Canyon Dam, where 34 feet can become the difference between flexibility and improvisation. The weak point is not the entire Colorado River system. The weak point is a small set of openings through one concrete dam. Glen Canyon Dam appears almost impossibly solid. It rises more than 700 feet from its foundation, holds back one of the largest reservoirs in the United States, and contains enough concrete to suggest permanence. But water systems do not fail according to the size of their largest structure. They fail according to the capacity, condition, and position of the narrowest pathway that must continue working. At Glen Canyon, those pathways are the 8 penstocks feeding the turbines and the 4 river outlet pipes that bypass them. As Lake Powell approaches minimum power pool, the entire downstream system becomes increasingly dependent on the second group. 4 steel pipes, each about 8 feet in diameter, hidden inside a dam built for a much wetter operating range. Under ordinary conditions, most water released from Lake Powell moves through the penstocks. The journey is efficient. Water passes through the turbines, produces electricity, enters the river below the dam, and continues toward the Grand Canyon and Lake Mead. One flow performs 2 jobs. It satisfies a downstream release while generating power. The river outlet works exist as an alternative route. They can move water around the turbines when the power plant is unavailable, when maintenance requires another pathway, or when releases exceed what the generating units can carry. Operators sometimes call them bypass tubes because they bypass the power plant entirely. Water still reaches the Colorado River, but no electricity is recovered from its fall. In normal operations, these outlets are support equipment. Near minimum power pool, they become something more consequential. They become the main doorway through which the river may have to pass. This is the infrastructure weak point. Not because the outlets are known to be failing. The Bureau of Reclamation has emphasized that Glen Canyon Dam remains safe and that its ability to deliver water downstream is not presently at risk. The concern is dependency. A complex system with multiple release pathways can adapt to maintenance, equipment trouble, and changing demand. A system relying primarily on 4 lower outlets has fewer ways to adapt. Redundancy is not the same as capacity. Capacity is how much water a component can carry. Redundancy is how many independent choices remain when one component is unavailable. Below minimum power pool, Glen Canyon could lose the choice of moving routine releases through 8 turbines. The river would continue, but the operating system would become narrower. Each of the 4 river outlets is controlled by large gates and hollow jet valves. Together, the outlet works have a designed release capacity of roughly 15,000 cubic feet per second under favorable reservoir conditions. That number sounds enormous. 1 cubic foot is a little more than 7 gallons. 15,000 cubic feet each second represents a powerful artificial river passing through steel. Yet the headline capacity does not tell the whole story. The actual amount an outlet can release depends partly on reservoir elevation. Higher water creates greater pressure. Lower water creates less. As Lake Powell falls, the same loss of hydraulic head that weakens the turbines can also reduce the amount of water that lower outlets can move. The dam does not approach a threshold while all other abilities remain fixed. Its release capacity changes with the reservoir. The visible number is lake elevation. The hidden vulnerability is declining discharge pressure. This matters because Glen Canyon Dam is required to manage more than average flow. Operators must accommodate daily schedules, environmental requirements, maintenance, unexpected equipment conditions, and the need to deliver water downstream over time. A system built around several pathways can distribute those tasks. A system concentrated through 4 outlets has to schedule them carefully. 1 pipe removed from service would represent a meaningful share of the available route. 2 pipes unavailable at once would narrow the pathway further. Again, this does not mean such a failure is expected. It explains why maintenance becomes more important as dependency rises. The smaller component has to carry a larger share of the mission. Reclamation began relining the river outlets after more than 6 decades of service. The original internal coating had reached the point where normal wear required replacement. Crews used robotic equipment to remove the old coating and apply modern protective layers. The work was not evidence of imminent structural failure. It was ordinary infrastructure stewardship, made unusually significant by the reservoir's position. A pipe used occasionally can tolerate a different maintenance environment, from a pipe that may become the primary means of releasing the river. The physical object is the same. Its system importance changes. This is one of the central laws of infrastructure risk. A component becomes critical not only when it weakens, but when every alternative around it disappears. The outlets also change the character of the water released downstream. At higher reservoir levels, the penstocks draw from a particular depth and temperature layer. At lower levels, the relationship between the water surface and each intake shifts. The river outlet works are positioned below the penstocks, allowing them to draw colder water from deeper in the reservoir under many conditions. That can be useful for managing downstream temperatures. Reclamation has mixed water released through the turbines, with colder water from the outlets to influence river conditions below the dam. But if the reservoir falls far enough, the temperature structure changes. The lake becomes shallower. Warm surface layers occupy a larger proportion of the remaining water column. Sediment moving through the reservoir becomes more relevant. Water quality conditions near the intakes can shift. A pathway designed mainly to move water can suddenly become part of an ecological management problem. The small component is carrying hydraulic, legal, electrical, and biological consequences at once. Now imagine an operator inside the dam during a period when Lake Powell has fallen below minimum power pool. The generating units are no longer the routine release route. The outlet works are open. Water accelerates through the pipes and exits through hollow jet valves into the river. The sound is continuous, deep, and mechanical. Every release must be coordinated with downstream requirements. Every inspection matters. Every vibration, pressure reading, gate position, and maintenance interval has greater significance because fewer substitutes remain available. The dam is still functioning, but function has become concentration. The system has moved from 8 power pathways plus 4 bypass pathways toward dependence on the 4 bypasses alone. That is the difference between normal operation and constrained operation. Normal operation distributes load. Constrained operation concentrates it. The next weak point lies immediately outside the water pathway. It is the loss of generation itself. Glen Canyon's 8 turbines have a total nameplate capacity of just over 1,000 megawatts. Actual output varies, especially at low reservoir levels, but the plant remains a valuable source of federal hydropower and fast response capability. When the penstocks can no longer feed the turbines normally, every acre-foot released downstream produces no electricity at the dam. The water performs its delivery function, but loses its energy function. This is not merely an efficiency problem. Revenue from hydropower supports parts of the broader Colorado River storage project, including operations, maintenance, environmental programs, and repayment obligations. Reduced generation can therefore weaken financial support around the same infrastructure being asked to adapt to extreme conditions. Water scarcity removes power. Lost power removes revenue. Lost revenue increases pressure on the institutions maintaining the water system. The weak point begins as a pipe and expands into a budget. Then it enters the transmission system. Glen Canyon Dam connects to a regional network, not directly to one city. Grid operators can replace its energy with other resources, but replacement is not frictionless. A natural gas plant may produce the missing electricity, but it requires fuel. A solar facility may provide energy during daylight, but not after sunset without storage. A battery may respond quickly, but only for a limited duration. Another hydroelectric dam may help, but drought may be affecting that reservoir as well. Transmission capacity determines whether replacement power can physically reach the customers who need it. The local grid may continue operating perfectly, while the regional system becomes more expensive and less flexible. This is how one weak point creates a chain without producing an immediate blackout. The first consequence is not darkness, it is reduced reserve. The next is higher cost. The next may be deferred investment. Only later, during another stress event, does the missing margin become visible. Downstream, Lake Mead depends on water released through Glen Canyon Dam. Farms, cities, tribal communities, industries, wildlife refuges, and international deliveries depend on the larger river system. No single outlet pipe determines all of those outcomes by itself, but the physical ability to move water through the dam is the link between storage in Lake Powell and every obligation below it. Legal agreements can specify volumes. Computer models can schedule releases. Political leaders can negotiate conservation. None of those actions moves a gallon through concrete. At the final moment, water must fit through an opening. This is where the scale of the Colorado River becomes strangely intimate. A basin spanning 7 states and 2 countries narrows into steel pipes measured in feet. The weak point is not a metaphor, it has a diameter. There is another threshold below minimum power pool, known as dead pool. Near the elevation, where water could no longer pass through the existing outlets by gravity, Lake Powell is not currently at that level, and reaching it is not inevitable. But its existence reveals the structure of the risk. Minimum power pool is where the energy pathway is lost. Dead pool is where the gravity delivery pathway itself becomes severely compromised. Between those elevations, the system would be moving through a zone of reduced options. Pumps, new outlet modifications, altered operations, or other engineering responses might be considered, but those measures require planning, construction, money, permits, and time. Concrete can be modified. Time cannot be installed after it is gone. But that is not the most dangerous part. The most dangerous part is the possibility that people continue judging the system by whether the dam is still standing. Structural collapse is not the relevant scenario. The dam can remain completely intact while losing the functions around which the region organized water and power. The turbines can stop before the river stops. Hydropower revenue can fall before water deliveries fail. Outlet dependency can rise before any pipe breaks. Grid costs can increase before customers understand why. Infrastructure failure is often imagined as destruction. Here, the more plausible warning is functional erosion. The structure remains. The margin disappears. The weak point is not the whole dam. It is the shrinking number of pathways through which the dam can continue being useful. 4 outlets instead of 8 turbines, and 4 outlets. Less pressure instead of more. Water delivery without power generation. Maintenance performed while dependency rises. A regional system narrowed into a handful of valves inside concrete. This is not proof that Glen Canyon Dam will fail. It is proof that the dam can enter an operating condition in which small components carry consequences far larger than their size. And this is not speculation invented for a distant future. The Colorado River has already produced moments when a reservoir approached an operational limit, when emergency water was moved to protect infrastructure, and when one unexpected hydrologic shift forced engineers to confront a different kind of danger at the same dam. The evidence is waiting in the system's own history. This is not speculation. A version of this mechanism has already left evidence behind, and Glen Canyon Dam itself carries one of the clearest records. In 1983, the warning came from the opposite direction. Lake Powell was not approaching minimum power pool. It was rising toward the top of the dam's operating range after an extraordinary snow year and a spring runoff that exceeded expectations. Forecasts changed quickly. Mountain snow remained deep. Temperatures accelerated melting. Water entered the reservoir faster than ordinary releases could control it. The same structure now being tested by scarcity was then tested by abundance. That contrast matters because it reveals the central weakness of large water systems. The danger is not always too little water or too much water by itself. The danger appears when reality moves outside the assumptions built into operations. In 1983, operators opened the spillways at Glen Canyon Dam to release enormous volumes of water around the power plant and river outlets. These spillways are not the small bypass pipes discussed earlier. They are massive tunnels cut through the canyon walls, built to carry extreme flows when the regular release system cannot move enough water. Water entered the tunnels at high speed. At first, the structure performed its intended function. Then operators began hearing a sound that did not belong there. The tunnels were vibrating. Concrete fragments appeared in the discharge. The flow had created cavitation, the same destructive process that can affect turbines and valves when pressure falls low enough for vapor bubbles to form. Those bubbles collapsed with extraordinary force against the spillway surfaces. The damage did not begin as a visible crack across the dam. It began inside fast-moving water. In one tunnel, cavitation tore a hole deep into the concrete floor and surrounding rock. Bureau of Reclamation records describe severe erosion damage in both spillways during sustained releases of roughly 30,000 cubic feet per second. Crews had to inspect, repair, and redesign sections after the flood. Engineers added aeration slots that deliberately inject air beneath the water flow. That air cushions the collapse of vapor cavities and reduces destructive pressure against the tunnel surface. The lesson was precise. A pathway can appear large enough on paper and still encounter a hidden hydraulic limit under real operating conditions. The failure was not that the dam disappeared. The failure was that water moving through one specific component behaved differently from what the original design fully anticipated. The structure survived because operators recognized the damage, reduced exposure where possible, and engineers modified the spillways afterward. The 1983 flood is not evidence that today's low reservoir will damage the same tunnels in the same way. The present problem is different. Spillways require high reservoir levels and are irrelevant near minimum power pool. But the event proves something more useful than a dramatic comparison. It proves that Glen Canyon Dam can enter an unfamiliar operating condition in which a secondary pathway suddenly becomes essential, and the behavior of that pathway becomes the center of the entire system. In 1983, the emergency pathway was the spillway. In a future below minimum power pool, the critical pathway would be the river outlet works. The direction of stress has reversed. The operational principle has not. When normal routes lose capacity, components designed for exceptional use must carry sustained responsibility. That is where hidden weaknesses become visible. A more direct precedent began after the year 2000, when the Colorado River Basin entered what federal agencies describe as a historic, extended drought. Lake Powell and Lake Mead had been close to full near the end of the 1990s. Then the river began delivering a sequence of dry years, interrupted by only partial recoveries. Reservoir storage fell, shorelines retreated, hydropower generation declined. Water managers initially treated many of the losses as drought conditions that would eventually reverse, but the recovery repeatedly failed to restore the old baseline. One wet season could lift the reservoirs. Several hot, dry seasons could erase the gain. By the second decade of the century, the pattern had become difficult to describe as a temporary interruption. The basin was not simply waiting for normal to return. Normal itself was becoming less reliable. The year 2002 provided an early shock. Runoff across the upper Colorado River Basin was exceptionally low. Rivers that normally carried the spring snowmelt into Lake Powell delivered only a fraction of expected flow. The reservoir dropped rapidly. That year did not push Powell below minimum power pool, but it demonstrated how quickly a large system can lose storage when inflow collapses while releases continue. Later dry years repeated the mechanism. The lake surface moved through elevations that had once seemed protected by sheer reservoir size. Each decline exposed more canyon wall and reduced hydraulic head at the dam. The signal was no longer theoretical. The machine was losing pressure because the basin was losing effective runoff. By 2021, the Bureau of Reclamation was publicly projecting a meaningful risk that Lake Powell could fall below minimum power pool within the planning horizon. Federal forecasts showed the possibility of reaching the threshold as early as the following year, under extremely dry conditions. The protective elevation of 3,525 feet became central to drought response planning. This target stood only 35 feet above minimum power pool. In March of 2022, Lake Powell fell below it. For the first time since the reservoir initially filled, the system entered the zone federal planners had identified as requiring protective action. That moment is the closest precedent to the current warning. The lake did not cross minimum power pool. The turbines did not stop. Downstream delivery did not fail. But the basin had moved close enough to the threshold that agencies began rearranging stored water across the upper system to defend the dam's operating margin. Under the Drought Response Operations Agreement, Reclamation and the upper basin states released additional water from Flaming Gorge Reservoir. The plan moved 500,000 acre-feet beyond normal operations toward Lake Powell between the spring of 2022 and the spring of 2023. At the same time, the annual release from Glen Canyon Dam was reduced by another 500,000 acre-feet compared with the previously planned volume. Together, those actions preserved roughly 1 million acre-feet of additional storage in Lake Powell, equivalent at the time to about 16 feet of reservoir elevation. 16 feet did not end the drought. It created distance from the power pool threshold. This is the historical precedent that matters most. The system already had to borrow water from one reservoir and hold back water from another destination to protect the functioning of Glen Canyon Dam. Emergency management did not produce new supply. It redistributed scarcity. Flaming Gorge sits far upstream on the Green River in Wyoming and Utah. Releasing additional water lowered its own storage and affected recreation, shorelines, local infrastructure, and future flexibility there. Reducing releases from Lake Powell protected its elevation, but meant less water moved toward Lake Mead than previously scheduled. Every protective action created a consequence somewhere else. The intervention worked in the narrow operational sense. It reduced the immediate probability of losing hydropower, but it also revealed that the Colorado River system had reached a condition where normal inflow was no longer enough to protect every objective simultaneously. Managers had to choose which margin to defend. Then came the winter of 2022 and 2023. Snow accumulated across the upper basin at levels far above recent years. Spring runoff lifted Lake Powell dramatically. Reclamation reported that expected inflow for the water year exceeded the total inflow of the previous 3 years combined. The emergency release planned from upstream reservoirs was no longer needed for that operating year. Lake Powell rose by dozens of feet. The recovery was real. It provided hydropower relief, restored storage, improved boat access, and created distance from critical elevations. But the wet year also became a test of public memory. It was easy to see a rising reservoir and assume the crisis had ended. The precedent says otherwise. One strong year can refill part of the operating margin. It does not erase the structural water imbalance that consumed the margin in the first place. The lake rose, but not to full pool. The basin recovered, but not to the conditions of the late 1990s. A wet year interrupted the decline. It did not prove the old hydrology had returned. Scientific evidence helps explain why. Researchers with the United States Geological Survey have found that warming has reduced Colorado River flow by increasing evaporation and reducing reflective snow cover. One major study estimated that annual mean flow declines by roughly 9% for each degree Celsius of warming, primarily because less snow remains on the ground to reflect sunlight and more energy becomes available to evaporate water. Other research has shown that warmer spring temperatures reduce runoff efficiency even when precipitation appears favorable. These findings do not mean every low inflow year can be assigned to one cause. Weather variability, storm tracks, soil moisture, dust, land conditions, and water use all influence the result. The evidence does show that warming changes the background conditions through which every snow season must pass. The same snowfall can produce less river. The historical record therefore contains two connected warnings. The first comes from 1983. A dam built for enormous flows encountered destructive behavior when an emergency pathway operated under unusual load. The second comes from 2022. A reservoir built to buffer drought came close enough to a critical threshold that water had to be moved across the basin to preserve its power function. One warning came from excess, one came from scarcity. Both demonstrate that a system can remain standing while its operating assumptions fail. But the differences are equally important. The 1983 event was rapid. Water rose over weeks and forced immediate action. The damage was physical and visible inside the spillway tunnels. Today's decline is slower. It unfolds over seasons and years. Its first damage appears as lost flexibility, lower generation, emergency coordination, altered releases, and transferred costs. The flood created a crisis of capacity. The drought creates a crisis of recovery. Engineers could repair the spillways with stronger surfaces and aeration slots. No comparable modification can force the mountains to produce runoff. This is why history should not be used as a prophecy. 1983 does not prove the outlet works will fail. 2022 does not prove Lake Powell will cross minimum power pool. The wet winter that followed proves that large gains remain possible. But the record establishes the mechanism beyond imagination. Forecasts can move quickly. Secondary pathways can become critical. Operating margins can shrink to the point where emergency water transfers are justified. One favorable season can delay the threshold without removing the conditions that made the threshold reachable. The lesson not fully absorbed is that success during an emergency can hide the severity of the emergency. The turbines kept turning in 2022, so the protection may look unnecessary in retrospect. But they kept turning partly because managers changed the system before the threshold was crossed. Avoided failure leaves no wreckage. It leaves a decision, a transferred volume of water, and a few extra feet on a reservoir gauge. That is why the current 34-foot margin should not be read as proof of collapse or proof of safety. It should be read as evidence that the Colorado River has returned to an operating zone it entered only recently, a zone where recovery depends on weather, conservation, release decisions, and the willingness to move risk from one reservoir to another. History has already shown that Glen Canyon Dam can survive conditions outside its original assumptions. The larger question is how often the system can repeat those emergency adjustments before exceptional operations become the new operating pattern. The pattern is larger than Lake Powell because the reservoir is not only storing water, it is storing assumptions. It stores the assumption that winter snow will become spring runoff with enough consistency to support planned releases. It stores the assumption that wet years will arrive frequently enough to repair losses from dry years. It stores the assumption that electricity, agriculture, cities, ecosystems, and legal deliveries can all depend on the same river without repeatedly forcing the system toward its lowest operating thresholds. Glen Canyon Dam is the warning because those assumptions are now being tested together. This is not only a low reservoir, it is a calendar failure, an infrastructure test, and a recovery failure occupying the same place. The old calendar began with winter accumulation, followed by spring snowmelt, rising reservoirs, summer demand, and a gradual decline into autumn. No year followed that pattern perfectly, but the sequence was stable enough to organize decisions. Farmers selected crops before irrigation season. Hydropower managers planned generation. Cities estimated supply. Reservoir operators calculated releases using historical ranges. The system accepted uncertainty because the calendar itself remained broadly recognizable. That calendar is now becoming less dependable. Snow can melt earlier. Warm spring conditions can reduce the amount of meltwater that becomes stream flow. Dry soils can absorb runoff before it reaches tributaries. Extreme heat can increase evaporation, while electricity and water demand are rising. A wet winter may still produce a large recovery, but the relationship between snowfall, runoff, storage, and summer supply is no longer as simple as it once appeared. The weather still moves through seasons. The infrastructure no longer receives those seasons in the same way. This is what a new baseline looks like before anyone agrees to call it one. It does not arrive as a single official declaration. It appears as repeated exceptions. Emergency releases from upstream reservoirs, temporary conservation programs, altered annual releases, new forecast scenarios, revised operating guidelines, hydropower purchases, delayed maintenance. Negotiations that begin before the previous negotiation has fully ended. Each action is described as a response to unusual conditions. Then, unusual conditions return often enough that the response becomes part of normal operations. The system does not cross one clear line between old and new. It spends years trying to preserve the old system with increasingly exceptional measures. Lake Powell reveals that transition because it was built as a buffer against variability. Its purpose was not merely to hold water in a scenic canyon. It was designed to capture high flows, release water during dry periods, generate electricity, and help coordinate obligations between the upper and lower basins. A reservoir of that scale is supposed to create time, but when storage remains low through repeated stress, the reservoir stops absorbing uncertainty and begins transmitting it. Weak runoff becomes a hydropower warning. A hydropower warning becomes a market cost. A release decision becomes a dispute between reservoirs. An uncertain snow season becomes a planning problem for farms and cities before the snow has even melted. The buffer becomes a messenger. That is the system expansion. The danger is not confined to the elevation behind one dam. It is the possibility that every part of the basin begins operating with less time, less redundancy, and less confidence. Federal projections released during the current water year make that pattern difficult to ignore. The Bureau of Reclamation reported extremely weak inflow possibilities for Lake Powell, with the lowest planning scenarios near 1/3 of the historical average. Its modeling showed that without major intervention, the reservoir could approach or fall below minimum power pool during the operating horizon. A projection is not a guaranteed outcome. Weather can improve. Conservation can preserve storage. Release plans can change. Yet the reason agencies publish such projections is precisely because infrastructure cannot wait for certainty. When a plausible scenario reaches a critical elevation, the system must begin acting before the water arrives there. That creates a new kind of operational calendar. Instead of preparing according to seasons alone, managers prepare according to thresholds. 3,525 feet becomes a protection zone. 3,490 feet becomes a power boundary. Lower elevations become release constraints. The river is divided not only by months and legal accounting periods, but by the functions that disappear as the surface falls. The old system asked how much water would arrive this year. The emerging system must ask which operations can still be protected if it does not. This change extends far beyond Lake Powell. Lake Mead receives releases from Glen Canyon Dam and supports water deliveries across the lower basin. Upstream reservoirs can send emergency water toward Powell, but doing so reduces their own protection. Groundwater can supplement surface supplies in some regions, but heavy pumping lowers aquifers that may require decades or centuries to recover. Cities can conserve, but municipal use represents only part of total basin demand. Agriculture can reduce consumption, but those reductions affect workers, rural economies, food production, habitat, and communities organized around irrigation. Hydropower can be replaced, but replacement electricity requires generation, fuel, transmission, storage, and money. Every adaptation is real. None is free. That is why the system cannot be understood as one reservoir running out of water. It is a network attempting to decide where scarcity will be absorbed. For decades, scarcity could be delayed through storage. Now, it increasingly arrives through allocation. Who uses less? Which reservoir falls? Which power customer pays more? Which farm field is left unplanted? Which ecosystem receives altered flows? Which community waits longer for infrastructure? Which project is postponed to protect another? The river does not decide these questions. It supplies the physical limit around which people must decide them. And as the limit tightens, old, legal, and political boundaries become harder to maintain. Water, originating as snow in one state, may be stored in another, generate electricity for customers elsewhere, support farms hundreds of miles downstream, pass through tribal homelands, cross an international border, and influence ecosystems along the entire route. A local decision rarely remains local. The Colorado River Compact and the larger body of laws, court decisions, treaties, agreements, and operating rules were created over decades to divide and manage that interconnected supply. Those institutions remain essential, but many were built using a historical record that represented a wetter river than the one experienced during much of the 21st century. The problem is not that earlier planners ignored drought. The problem is that their measurements could not fully include a future in which warming would reduce runoff efficiency and increase atmospheric demand. Infrastructure was built for variability around an expected center. The center itself is moving. Researchers with the United States Geological Survey have estimated that upper Colorado River flow declines by roughly 9% for each degree Celsius of warming, largely because snow loss exposes darker ground, allowing more solar energy to drive evaporation. That estimate does not predict the flow of any single year. It describes a pressure acting across many years. Storms still matter. Natural variability still matters. Water use still matters. But warmer background conditions can take a similar amount of precipitation and return less usable river flow. This is the abnormal pattern behind the reservoir gauge. The basin is not only experiencing dry weather, it is experiencing a change in the conversion between weather and water. That is why a strong snowpack can no longer be treated as complete recovery. It may produce an excellent runoff year. It may raise Lake Powell by many feet. It may reduce the immediate risk to hydropower. But recovery must now be judged by what happens after the peak, how much storage remains after summer releases, how quickly soils dry, whether the following winter is strong or weak, whether conservation continues when the shoreline rises. Whether emergency measures are used to rebuild resilience or merely to postpone another emergency, the future will not be decided only by the highest reservoir elevation reached after one wet year. It will be decided by the elevation at which the next dry sequence begins. This creates a recovery trap. When Lake Powell is high, managers have time to negotiate, experiment, repair infrastructure, and absorb forecast error. When it is low, every action becomes urgent. Urgency encourages temporary solutions because permanent agreements are difficult. Temporary solutions preserve the system for another season, but may not resolve the underlying imbalance. Then another season begins from a similar position. The system survives, but it does not fully recover. Over time, crisis management becomes the operating model. The lights remain on. Water continues moving. The absence of collapse can create the illusion that the system is stable. In reality, skilled operators and conservation measures may be working continuously to prevent a narrow margin from becoming visible failure. This is not only a water shortage, it is a governance load. Agencies must model more scenarios. States must negotiate sharper reductions. Utilities must replace uncertain hydropower. Tribal nations must fight to convert legal rights into usable infrastructure, while the overall supply becomes more contested. Environmental managers must protect species and river conditions with less operational flexibility. Farmers must make decisions before hydrology is fully known. Households receive the final consequences through prices, restrictions, employment, and reliability. The reservoir gauge becomes a measure of institutional workload. The lower it falls, the more coordination is required to keep ordinary life looking ordinary. Where will the risk move next? It may move earlier into spring as snowmelt timing shifts. It may move into summer electricity markets when heat raises demand, while hydropower flexibility falls. It may move upstream when emergency releases reduce storage in smaller reservoirs. It may move into agricultural planning as uncertain deliveries shorten planting windows. It may move into municipal budgets as cities pay for conservation, recycling, groundwater management, new intake structures, and long-distance supply projects. It may move into ecosystems when release temperatures and seasonal flow patterns change. It may move into negotiations themselves as every participant arrives with less margin to surrender. The future echo of Glen Canyon Dam is not that every reservoir will reach the same elevation. It is that infrastructure across the West may increasingly be asked to perform outside the climate range, demand pattern, and recovery schedule around which it was designed. Reservoirs will face larger swings. Power grids will manage higher heat demand and changing generation. Water treatment plants will confront warmer and sometimes lower quality supplies. Roads, canals, pumps, farms, and cities will all depend on systems whose safety margins were calculated from an older record. The warning is not that adaptation is impossible. Western cities have already reduced per-person water use. Agricultural districts have improved efficiency and participated in conservation programs. Utilities are adding renewable generation, storage, and more flexible resources. Engineers are maintaining outlets, studying intake modifications, and planning for lower reservoir conditions. Federal agencies are evaluating new operating rules for Lake Powell and Lake Mead after the current guidelines expire. The system is capable of change, but adaptation succeeds only when it moves faster than margin disappears. That is the question Lake Powell places before the entire basin. Not whether one wet winter can lift the lake, not whether one emergency release can protect the turbines, not whether one agreement can postpone shortage. The question is whether water use, infrastructure, law, and energy planning can be rebuilt around the river that now exists rather than the river the system once expected. 34 feet is the immediate measurement. Glen Canyon Dam is the deeper warning. It shows what happens when a structure built to create certainty begins operating inside persistent uncertainty. The dam still holds. The turbines may still turn. Water still passes downstream. But every remaining function depends on a margin that the future must repeatedly replace. And before that warning becomes a prediction, one final boundary has to be drawn. What does the evidence actually prove? What remains uncertain? And what can be said without turning a serious operational risk into an exaggerated prophecy? The warning does not need exaggeration. The evidence is already enough. Lake Powell is low enough that the Bureau of Reclamation has projected a credible path below minimum power pool during the current planning horizon. The Colorado Basin River Forecast Center has recorded exceptionally weak runoff forecasts. Federal agencies are preparing actions intended to protect the elevation needed for normal hydropower generation and downstream operations. Those statements are supported by measurements, forecasts, engineering thresholds, and published operating plans. They describe a serious system risk, but they do not prove that Glen Canyon Dam will stop generating power on a specific date. They do not prove that downstream water deliveries will suddenly end. They do not prove that every electricity price increase, crop loss, ecosystem change, or household hardship in the West can be traced to one reservoir. Evidence becomes stronger when its boundary is visible, so that boundary matters. The current elevation is observed. The inflow forecast is an estimate. Minimum power pool is an engineering threshold. The timing of any crossing is conditional. Emergency releases can alter the trajectory. Conservation can preserve storage. Weather can improve it. A strong storm sequence can change the runoff outlook. A hot, dry spring can weaken it. Operational decisions can delay one consequence while transferring pressure to another reservoir or another year. The future is not fixed inside the present number. What is fixed is the narrowness of the margin from which the future must now be managed. It is also important to separate structural safety from functional risk. There is no evidence in the operating warning that Glen Canyon Dam is about to collapse. The concrete structure can remain sound while hydropower capability declines. The turbines can become unusable before the dam loses its ability to release water through lower outlets. The outlet works can continue moving water below minimum power pool, although with different capacity, pressure, maintenance, and operational constraints. A low reservoir is therefore not the same event as a failed dam. Confusing those scenarios would produce fear without understanding. The actual warning is more precise. A structure can remain standing while losing the functions around which an entire regional system was organized. That is not cinematic, it is operational. And it may be harder to manage because the public often recognizes infrastructure danger only after something physically breaks. The evidence also does not support blaming one dry year on climate change alone. Storm tracks vary naturally. Snowfall can shift sharply between seasons. Soil moisture, dust on snow, vegetation, temperature, evaporation, reservoir releases, and human consumption all influence Lake Powell. No single factor controls every annual movement. But the scientific record does support a broader conclusion. Warming increases atmospheric demand, reduces snow cover, changes melt timing, and can reduce the amount of precipitation that becomes river flow. Climate change does not have to create every drought to intensify the conditions through which drought acts. It changes the background. It loads the system before the next dry sequence arrives. That distinction protects the analysis from false certainty without removing the warning. The same caution applies to electricity. Losing Glen Canyon hydropower would not automatically cause a regional blackout. The Western grid contains many generators, transmission connections, market arrangements, batteries, and operating reserves. Utilities can replace energy. Grid operators can adjust schedules. Customers may never notice an immediate interruption, but replacement has consequences. It may cost more. It may depend on fuel, transmission capacity, storage duration, or another resource facing its own limitations. Hydropower provides flexible generation that can respond quickly to changing demand. Removing part of that capability does not guarantee grid failure. It reduces one layer of margin. A resilient system can absorb that loss. A system facing simultaneous heat, wildfire, transmission constraints, generator outages, or fuel problems may find the same loss far more significant. Risk is not created by one missing resource alone. It is created when several forms of backup are missing at the same time. The water supply evidence requires the same discipline. Lake Powell is not the only storage reservoir in the Colorado River Basin, and reservoir elevation is not the same as immediate household water availability. Cities maintain local storage, treatment plants, groundwater supplies, conservation programs, and diversified portfolios. Agricultural districts operate through separate delivery networks and priorities. Tribal nations hold distinct rights and face distinct infrastructure conditions. Mexico participates under international agreements. Falling water at Powell enters each of these systems differently. Some consequences are direct. Others are delayed through policy, finance, or future allocation. The reservoir does not send one identical shock to every user. It changes the operating environment in which all of them make decisions. That is the risk the evidence clearly supports. The system has less room to absorb error. A weak forecast matters more when storage is already low. A maintenance outage matters more when release pathways are concentrated. An expensive power market matters more when hydropower generation is reduced. A dry second year matters more when the first year ended without recovery. None of these conditions guarantees disaster. Together, they narrow the route by which disaster is avoided. This is why the headline number cannot be interpreted as a countdown clock. 34 feet is not 34 equal steps toward an inevitable ending. Reservoir elevation can rise or fall unevenly. The relationship between elevation and water volume changes with canyon geometry. Releases can be modified. Inflow can surprise in either direction. The lake may recover above the protective elevation. It may remain near the threshold. It may cross below it and later rise again. The honest statement is not that the future has been decided. The honest statement is that federal agencies are now planning around outcomes once considered extraordinary, because those outcomes have become physically plausible. That alone is a major change. Return to the official signal that opened this story. A reservoir gauge updates. The number appears beside Lake Powell. Roughly 34 feet separates the surface from minimum power pool. On a screen, the change may be only a decimal. At the dam, it represents the height of water pressing toward 8 turbines. Across the grid, it represents flexible electricity that may have to be replaced. Upstream, it represents storage that may be released to protect another reservoir. Downstream, it represents the ability to coordinate deliveries through a narrowing set of structures. Inside a household, it may eventually appear as a higher bill, a stricter conservation rule, or a difficult decision made during extreme heat. The gauge measures elevation. The system receives load. But Glen Canyon Dam is the warning for another reason. It shows that the most important infrastructure threshold is not always the moment a structure fails. Sometimes it is the moment the structure can no longer perform several jobs at once. For decades, water passing through Glen Canyon Dam generated electricity, supported downstream deliveries, produced revenue, helped balance the grid, and gave operators flexibility over timing. Near minimum power pool, those functions begin separating. Water may still pass, but without power. Power may still be supplied, but at higher cost from somewhere else. Downstream obligations may still be met, but with less storage protecting the next year. The system continues by dividing one efficient pathway into several more difficult ones. That is functional erosion. It is quieter than collapse. It can last longer, and because ordinary life may continue, it is easy to mistake adaptation for safety. The event will pass in the sense that every forecast window eventually closes. This runoff season will end. The reservoir will reach a low point and then respond to the next winter. Agencies will revise projections. Operators will adjust releases. Snow will return to the mountains. Some years will be wet. Some will provide real recovery. There is no evidence that the Colorado River simply disappears on a fixed date. There is also no evidence that one favorable season restores the assumptions under which the system was built. The thing revealed by this warning will remain. A reservoir designed to absorb hydrologic uncertainty is itself operating inside uncertainty. A power plant designed around stored elevation is approaching the lower boundary of that elevation. A legal and economic system built around predictable volumes must now negotiate what happens when prediction becomes less dependable. That does not make adaptation impossible. It makes delay expensive. The choices are not limited to collapse or denial. Water users can reduce consumption. Cities can continue improving efficiency, reuse, and conservation. Agricultural programs can compensate voluntary reductions while protecting communities from unmanaged economic loss. Tribal water infrastructure can be funded, so legal rights become usable water rather than promises on paper. Utilities can add generation, storage, transmission, and demand flexibility to reduce dependence on any single resource. Engineers can maintain lower outlets, study modifications, and prepare for operating conditions outside historical experience. States, federal agencies, tribes, water districts, environmental groups, and Mexico can build rules around a river that is more variable and often smaller than the record once suggested. None of these actions guarantees comfort. Together, they can restore margin, and margin is the central word. Not abundance, not certainty, margin, the distance between forecast and failure, the time between one dry year and the next, the spare turbine, the maintained outlet, the stored acre-foot, the affordable megawatt, the legal agreement completed before emergency conditions remove the space for compromise. The future of Lake Powell will not be decided only by whether the surface crosses 3,490 feet. It will be decided by whether the system can create new forms of margin before the old ones are exhausted. Tomorrow morning, the reservoir gauge will update again. The number may move only slightly. The dam will still stand across the canyon. Water may continue through the turbines. Transmission lines will carry electricity away from the desert. From a distance, the system may look unchanged, but the viewer now knows what the number contains. It contains mountain snow that did not become runoff. It contains pressure no longer available to the turbines. It contains emergency water stored upstream. It contains choices that become more expensive as the surface falls. This is not just a drought. This is an operating margin failure. And the question left by Glen Canyon Dam is not whether the West can survive one more low reservoir year. It is whether a system built to store water can learn, before the next load arrives, to store enough time